Here are my tips for mixing colors. One way to make color mixing easier is to use a limited palette. If you're familiar with my color mixing videos, you'll see that I only use 5 colors plus white. Using fewer colors makes things simpler because you got less colors to choose from. You become more familiar with each color because you use it more often. People often comment on my videos that they can guess what the next color is that I'm going to use, and I believe that has to do with using a limited palette. After watching so many of my color mixing videos, people start to notice different patterns and they can start to understand how I go about color mixing. But the interesting thing is, if I switch the colors on my palette, it makes things harder for people to guess which color I'm going to use next. And that's because they get used to seeing me use the same colors over and over again. It makes them more familiar with how they work together, and that's the whole advantage of using a limited palette. I recommend laying your colors out in the same location on your palette every time you paint, and that's simply to just help you to develop muscle memory. When you need a small dab of blue, you know exactly where to go for it. People often ask me if you can use recipes or if I write the formulas down for the colors that I mix. I can understand how people think that that might be a good way to mix colors for a painting. I mean, if you go to a hardware store, you pick out a color swatch and they can mix it. I think it would be too slow to use a recipe book or formulas to mix colors as an artist. I think the reason for that is that I could probably mix the color faster than I could look it up in a book. I don't have a recipe book for artists, but I do have this Pantone color guide. So I did a side-by-side comparison here where on the left I'm mixing the color by eye, and on the right I'm picking out the color out of the Pantone guide. The color that I mix by eye actually turns out more accurate. Even if it takes the same amount of time to pick the color out of the Pantone guide, you would still have to mix it. And the problem with that is you'd have to find some way to measure out the quantities of paint. I tried weighing it with my scale, but it didn't even register. It's not sensitive enough. You really want to learn how to mix colors intuitively just by understanding color theory. And that's what I cover in my course. The link is in the description. I cover the materials that I use, including the paints and the brushes. If you want to get good at color mixing, you have to become familiar with the tinting strength of all your pigments. And tinting strength is how strong a color is. For example, phthalo blue has a strong tinting strength. And that means a very tiny amount of phthalo blue will have a dramatic impact on your color mixture. This can make color mixing counterintuitive because you would assume that if you wanted to mix green, you could mix equal portions of yellow and phthalo blue. But if you did that, it would become a very strong bluish green. The blue would overpower the yellow. To mix a green that's kind of in the middle, you would mix mostly yellow with a small dab of phthalo blue. In this example, I mix equal portions of black and white. There's 1 teaspoon of white and 1 teaspoon of black. And I try this with 3 different black pigments. And you'll see that it's the carbon black that has the highest tinting strength. So you can't mix a middle gray by mixing 50% white with 50% black. One way to avoid having to start over because you added too much of a color is to, for one, you start with a larger volume of color. Like if you watch my color mixing videos, I use a small paintbrush and I mix the color on a sheet of paper. And I do that because it's the fastest way to mix a color for my videos. I only have so much time to mix a color, so I do it in the fastest way possible. But the problem with that is that it's also harder because since it's such a small quantity of paint, any little dab of color I add to that has a big influence on it. So that's very difficult to do when you're first learning how to mix colors. So what I recommend you do is use a palette knife and use a larger quantity of paint like this. It'll take you longer to match a color, but it'll be easier. Another tip is that since you have more color to work with here, you can take a little bit off to the side, and then I'll just guess and say ultramarine blue would be what I want to use. I could test it out over here, and that is making it more purple. So if that was actually producing a different result and I didn't like it, I would only have to discard this small amount of paint and I could go back to this mixture over here instead of having to start over. It's best to add a little bit at a time instead of overshooting it, and then you'd have to start over or try and compensate for it, which is hard to do. See, that's pretty close right there. If you found this video useful, you'll want to subscribe so that you'll know when I have new videos available. I also have a color mixing playlist that you might find helpful too. Thanks for watching.